Good morning. Morning, Chairman Beckman, Chairman Brandon. Thank y'all for this opportunity to come before you. I do have some other commissioners with us out here. Quickly is our past president and past vice president is Mr. Van Lowry, our present vice president, Ms. Sissy Smitherman, and we have some other election commissioners, Tony Johnson and I believe Mr. Rogers, with us today. But our concern is kind of the conference call as well, is that we're going to have more manpower. I'm sure y'all aware of that because of the social distances, because a lot of folks is going to vote curbside. I can guarantee you that part of it is. We're going to have to consider our training now. It's going to be different for November. Going forward, it's going to be totally different than what we have ever seen. I'm sure y'all already got down to dealing with the masses and all of that sort of thing, the shields we talked about on the conference call. And I did have a meeting with our own circuit clerk, and we are in a county, Madison County, where we have like over 106,000 voters. So we have big precincts. And manpower is going to be very important because we're going to be dealing with social distances. So we're going to have people to inside as well as on the outside making sure this happens. Also, we're going to have curbside voting people to continue to keep it voting. Absentee voting, I'm sure the circuit clerk is going to address that, is going to go up. We're going to have manpower to help and assist with all of that sort of thing that's going to be going forward with us in this particular point in time. And I think as the conference call went, is that basically you're going to supply a lot of this material to us. It's like the shields, the masks, and those type of things. Am I correct? I believe that's correct. Okay. And so there was a lot of discussion about different things that we could have or could not have. I don't know whether y'all have come up with that yet or what we could spend some of this money on yet or not. I don't know. That conversation was, y'all didn't have no idea.
Those plans haven't been formalized, but we are considering all those options. And that's part of what this is today, to get input from individuals about what they might need. Okay.
So we're going to have a runoff in the next couple of weeks. I know the Secretary of State knows, Mr. Watson, but the ideal of it is, I don't know whether some of that stuff is going to be available for that or not on the 23rd, because we're having a lot of poll workers now that do not want to work. And so we're having to go through a lot of different people to get this to happen, and some is not going to be trained. And the reason being is because of COVID-19. And so I hope you're all aware of some of that kind of thing. I got a meeting with our supervisors in the next few weeks about that same thing. And going forward, we're going in all 82 counties, we're going to have that problem. And so we're going to have to address that problem because it's going to be a small problem. And we hope that, and then the other thing is that poll workers, we talked about it on the conference call, will they get any compensation different than what they see now for these long extended days plus to deal with this? And we've had commissioners, I've had emails that they're not going to run because of this, because they don't feel like they're compensated properly for these kind of things. So I want y'all to take some of that in consideration as we go forth with all of this.
I'm sure that we will take all those things into consideration. Matter of fact, they've been involved, those items have been involved in discussions, and so I know the Secretary is well aware of some of those things, and he has some additional funds other than what might come through here, and there's been some discussion about what they might do and kind of coordinating all that, and so we appreciate you mentioning those items, and we are considering those items.
Okay. Don't have anything quickly before I sit. I think that's it from our side of town.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for.
We might have some questions at the end, but right now.
Thank you all.
Next, Mr. Roger Gray from the Circuit Clerks Association.
Thank you for allowing us to be here today. My name's Chad Welford. I'll be representing the circuit clerks. I'm a clerk from George County. And the election commissioners talked about the supplies and stuff we need at the voting precincts and the additional help and stuff, so I'll leave that with them. But with COVID-19 happening, we have other issues to deal with. Voting machines, you know, right now we use a touch screen in the majority of the counties, and everybody's touching the same machine. And I'll reference one in particular, like the DS200 is a paper ballot machine. And I think a lot of clerks are wanting to go to that where an individual can have one ballot, they can color it in, and they can feed it through the machine without everybody touching the same ballot. So that's one thing that we're looking at to help get some money to upgrade equipment. Curbside voting with absentees, we don't really talk about advertising that, but we already do it. People that are disabled and have issues getting out of the car and stuff like that, the circuit clerks already handle that issue with them, so we think we're good with that issue. And the poll workers for absentee ballots, we do require some additional absentee help because of the increase we think will happen this year. And with the absentees, if you don't mind me mentioning it, House Bill 297 talks about absentees in the courthouse. Every clerk I've talked to is in favor of keeping all those absentees in the courthouse. The reason being is poll workers work long hours already, and they're just having to stay 2 or 3 hours extra to process those, and with additional absentees, it's going to increase that time more. We could have a committee that would process those at the courthouse that evening, and I think it would help with the poll workers that the election commissioner is trying to hire during this time frame. You know, we're going to be faced with challenges, and I think we're going to have to adapt through this process from here out. But that's our biggest concerns is, you know, make sure the absentees stay in the courthouse, looking at new voting machines to help with less touching of people on one machine, and then, you know, the supplies and cleaning and extra poll workers to help clean throughout the day. I want to ask Roger or Sandy, is there anything else we need to really mention? Y'all have any questions for us?
Idea on the cost of the extra or the additional machines or upgrades that you've mentioned?
No, I don't. I know for George County to upgrade to a full system of, you know, this is just one vendor. I haven't done quotes or anything like that or big purchase items. You're looking at about $200,000 to upgrade George County to a DS200 system. I don't know. I'm sure Michael Watson and some of his staff is in the process of looking at those numbers, and I'll let him give you an answer if he has that. But I know what George County would be.
Blackwell for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You mentioned keeping the absentee ballots at the courthouse. Are you talking about counting them there at the courthouse?
Yes, sir.
Well, you know, when the people come in to vote, there's a check and balance. If they filed absentee ballot, we don't let them vote again, so.
That is correct.
So how are you gonna prevent people from double voting?
What will happen there, in my idea, is at the end of voting on Saturday at 12 o'clock, I print my poll books. And all those ballots that have been cast for absentee is marked in Sims. And in the poll book, when it prints, it'll pre-mark it as voted absentee. So when you go into the voting precinct to vote, it's going to say you've already voted. You've already voted an absentee ballot. So that would keep somebody from double dipping on that.
Don't people have that option right now? They can cast their vote now absentee, they may change their mind, show up in person to vote, and we count that vote and not the absentee?
Right now we do, and my idea is to make it more of a final vote with absentee.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
No, I had it in me. Thank you, Mr. Graves, for being here. I just had a quick question. If you move to a paper system so people are touching the touch screens less, you're going to increase people touching the writing utensils, so I'm assuming that's an additional cost as well that would need to go along some type of,
It would be, but you can buy just cheap big pens for, 4 or 5 cents a piece, and during pandemics like this, that's probably one of the cheapest things you can buy to prevent people from touching behind other people, cheaper than cleaning and all the supplies that we're talking about. So just a cheap pen that person can sign the poll book with, that they got to sign to start with, take that same pen, color in their ballot, and walk over and drop it in a box, and they can take that pen home with them. Or they can be deposited in a box and be cleaned to reuse again. So I think in the long run, it would be an additional expense, but it would probably be offset by some of the other stuff we can save on.
right. I just want to make sure that that was included in your
Yes,
estimates. That way
I think so.
it was accounted for.
Reynolds?
You're acquainted that, we do have under law right now, and I believe Yallowbush and DeSoto, others do use the paper ballots, and we like that because our people like to do that, and I think it is safer. And would you not agree that it's that system would cost probably less to maintain in the long term than the touchscreen machines?
I don't know if I'm qualified to make a decision on maintenance on the long term, but I don't think it would be no more. I think it could be a savings or equal. But you're right. Every county that does it, from Hinds County to DeSoto County, and I think there's 4 or 5 other big counties that use the paper ballot, and they all like it, and their voters like it because they feel like they can trust that piece of paper that they marked their ballot on, and it goes into that machine.
Nobody wants to go the other way, do they?
No, sir. We thought when this changed years ago that the touchscreen was the best thing since sliced bread, but with time you realize that it's hard to doubt a piece of paper that you colored the dots in yourself.
Senator Blunt for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming up to Jackson. I think we're going to see, whether we make any changes to the law this year or not, I think we're going to see a dramatic increase in the number of Mississippians who want to vote by mail this November. Do you think that process as it exists today is a user-friendly process, or do you have any, either you individually or the clerks generally have any suggestions for us on how we can reduce errors and make that process more user-friendly for the voter?
If you want, I think the process we have now is good as far as mailing them out and them requesting a ballot and stuff. But if you want to reduce errors, keep the absentees in the courthouse. Poll workers are tired at 8 o'clock at night, and they sit there and have to look to make sure somebody signed across the flap, they did this, they did that, and we see probably more errors in that one aspect of an election than any other part of the election that we process.
When you say who's making the error?
The poll workers, at the end of the night, they've been there since 6 o'clock that morning.
Right.
They're processing, we use Hinds County example, they processed 7,000 absentee ballots through Hinds County in just one county. And they have to look for signatures, they have to look for seals, they have to look for all the steps that you go through on absentee process, witnesses, notary, and we see more in that one spot, I think, than any other spot in the whole voting system. And if you take that and you put it in the clerk's office, and you have, and I'm going to use this terminology, an absentee manager that's sitting there doing that, and that's their only responsibility, I see you eliminating 99.9% of those errors.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and letting people voting on the machine in the courthouse is you're not going to see any errors at all.
That is an option too, correct.
So, but the errors that are seen, what are they? Or is it the fact that you have to get the application notarized and the ballot notarized, and they have to complete two different envelopes? Or when they're going through that process, whether it takes place at the polling place or at the courthouse, and I agree with you, it should take place at the courthouse, what causes ballots to be rejected?
It can be the signature did not go across the flap, the witness or the notary did not go across the flap on the absentee ballot envelope, the voter might have not had the application witnessed or notarized, you know, just simple things like that you see a poll worker miss. The signature might not go across the flap, and the poll worker sees the signature and says accept, you know, or he didn't think it went across the flap and rejects it. If you've been working and I'm sure y'all put in long hours too, at the end of the day you get a little tired after 13, 14 hours.
Sure.
And if you had a fresh set of eyes doing this, I think it eliminates any possibility of that.
I think you're exactly right. And so, but the process as it is today is if a voter doesn't signs the envelope but doesn't sign it in the right place, or submits the envelope and it hasn't been notarized, or doesn't get the witness to sign in the right place, that vote's not going to count.
It should not count by law, correct?
Under the current law that we have today.
Correct.
And so if we have a lot of people voting absentee by mail this fall, there's just a lot of little parts of the process that could potentially trip a voter up and result in the ballot not being counted.
I don't think there's a lot of tripping up. I think it's the voter, we send out instructions with every ballot. A lot of clerks highlight, you know, exactly what you need to do. When you call for an absentee ballot, we tell you it's got to be notarized, it's got to be witnessed, you've got to sign across the flap. You know, we sit there and explain this stuff to people every day, and in the office when they vote, make sure you sign across the flap, and they just don't do it, you know, and you have to say, no, you got to go across the flap. So I don't think there's a problem with the way it's done. I think it's just people are not taking it quite as serious on the details of the law, that they don't realize it's that serious. And I don't know how to prevent that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here today. I have a question. I agree with you 100%. The absentee ballots need to stay in the courthouse. There's no question about that. What I want to know is, what do the circuit clerks want to, I want to visualize what that'll look like when somebody comes to vote absentee. Are we wanting them to sign a receipt book? Are we wanting them to fill out an application? Are we wanting them to do an envelope? Are they going to direct deposit that into a DS-200 or into a precinct scanner? What would that actually look like? What would the circuit clerks like?
I think there could be a couple different options. If you had DS-200 and the law was to allow people to deposit in there, that could be an option. But under the law we have right now, you would sign an application, fill out, notarize it. We would hand you a ballot. You would either go mark it, bring it back, put an envelope, seal up, sign across the flap, or you could have a secure box if it's a final vote and drop it in a secure box. You don't have to sign flaps, you don't have to do anything. It drops in a box, and that voter's over with. It's done. And at the end of the night, or end of the day, it's in the clerk's office under seal, and on Tuesday, on election day, you would have an absentee board come in, let's say 3 o'clock, and they would take those ballots and they would start processing them, stacking them up, getting them all lined up, depending on how many you had. Somebody in my office might not start till 6. Big county might start at 3 o'clock, and you don't count those till 7 o'clock. You don't want no preliminary results out. At 7 o'clock, they can start running, or 7:30 or 7:45, they can start running those ballots. And that way, you have results pretty much the same time your machines come in at night, instead of waiting until 11, 12, 1 o'clock for absentees to be processed. Because right now with poll workers doing it, they shut down the machines in the night, they do our accounting forms, they load the machines up, then they have to sit there and process every absentee, one behind the other. They're not getting to the courthouse in big counties till 9, 10 o'clock. This would eliminate all that and eliminate some errors.
I like that idea, thank you.
Thank you.
Question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for coming all the way up to Jackson. He touched on my question a little bit, but I want to ask you as a clerk the feasibility of something on Election Day. So in light of the pandemic, as Senator Blunt touched on, we're going to have a high influx of mail-in ballots, more than likely. And as you know, on election night, it takes a long time to get the ballots to the courthouse and then for the resolution board to, go through their process. So how feasible would it be, in your opinion, to do something like you mentioned, since it's the final vote, since the ballots are at the courthouse, to have poll workers or your resolution board at the courthouse at 7 a.m. on election day to start processing those absentee ballots from 7 to 7. So when polls close, you're ready to go, you're ready to run your report and put the results together. Is that something you could see happening on election day?
Yeah, and I think what I said a while ago is 3 o'clock. Based on the size of your county, I might not have but 400, 500, 600 absentees.
Right.
If somebody gets there at 5 o'clock, I got plenty of time to be ready by 7. DeSoto County, Hines County, Harrison County, they might need somebody there at 7 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 12 o'clock. I think that time frame should be left up to counties, but I don't think somebody should come to my courthouse at 7 a.m. and sit around all day long.
Right.
But I think you're exactly right. Whatever time frame they need to start to be finished by the end of the day, they know how many absentee ballots they got before that time frame. They know how many they normally vote, and allow the clerk to bring that committee in at the appropriate time.
Thank you so much. And a second question I have, in this bill you mentioned 297, we're going to give the clerks the option to vote to put the machines up in their offices, and if you're voting in person absentee, you simply cast your ballot as you would at the precinct. Now, one of the complaints we've had is from some smaller counties who said, they don't have the space or the manpower to do that. Is that a problem? I know your county's pretty small. Is that a problem that you see, or would you have the machines in your office if this bill were to pass?
If you do a DS200, and I'm just picking on one machine right now that's a scannable,
right.
It's not as big and bulky as trying to put some touch screens up in the courthouse and tearing down at the end of that. You can take that DS200 and roll it into the office, lock it up, roll it back out at the end of the day, okay? You're using paper ballots, the same paper ballots you would mail out. So the process is not bad. So the clerk's office would continue to vote people just like they would an envelope, but instead of putting an envelope and sealing it up, they just run it through a machine. So I think the majority of clerks could handle that.
So,
if we had a system like that.
Just being the devil's advocate and, thinking worst case scenario, if we can't get DS200s to all of you and you're stuck with your touch screens that you have right now, is that something you would still do, or would you prefer to stay with the
I think the
envelope?
touch screens would be a problem because you have to give privacy, and you're going to have to set them up in another room or another hallway, and you're going to have to tear them down every day, and there's so many steps that goes through that. I think the smaller counties would have trouble with help and location and process and that. So I think if you can't get the DS200s, I think you stay with the same process we have now as far as putting them in an envelope or dropping them in a box.
Particularly for the smaller counties?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna look at my colleagues out here and see if they agree with what I just said.
I see them
there.
shaking their hands and
Okay.
giving thumbs up back there, so.
Okay, thank you.
Cindy Summers for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You mentioned having a committee to help process the influx of absentees. Do you foresee circuit clerks across the state having to hire additional people? And if so, how much do you think that would cost?
I think that it would cost a little bit extra to process the absentee ballots because you would have to have a board. We already have a resolution board, and those can help with the process. So it wouldn't be a huge increase, okay? But I think you would save a little bit at the end of the night with poll workers because right now we pay poll workers a maximum of $125 a day. We expect them to get there at start start at 7 a.m., but get there at 6 a.m. setting up the stuff. Right now, they're not getting through to 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. With the influx in absentee ballots, we're expecting them to work another 2 hours. We're not going to get poll workers. I mean, we have poll workers not wanting to work because of this. So I think the offset there will not be a big difference. Could be a little bit, but I don't think it's a huge number that we'd be looking at, honestly.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate all that information. In the interest of time, we're going to go ahead next to Michael Watson, our Secretary of State.
Thank y'all for allowing me to be here.
Thank you very much for your information.
As I see it, I have 1 minute. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
We'll give you a couple minutes.
I will be quick and try to enunciate clearly. But I just want to say thank you. It's been a great pleasure for our office to be included in the conversations that we've had with both the chairman and chairwoman and just the committee as a whole. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. It's been good for us to kind of bounce our ideas off of each other. Yesterday, actually, we had 10 clerks in the office, one on the phone, so we had 11 total. So it's been one of the things that I learned in the legislature, obviously, is it's a team approach. It's not just me, it's us. And so to have them come into the office and sit down and say, all right, look, we've seen your plan. Here's what we think will work. Here's what we think won't work. And to have that constructive criticism has been great. So Chad, to your crew, appreciate all that you have done with us as well. The elections commissioners, we also sent our plan out to them and asked for comment on it. Got some pretty good comments. It was fun to have that process and kind of see their take as well. So I wanted to cover just a few things very quickly here, and obviously yield for questions if you have them. As you know, Holly Robertson is with me. Holly is our Assistant Secretary of State of Elections, knows much more than I do, so she can answer the questions a lot better than me, and we'll get her up here in a second. But perspective-wise, I want to be clear. Our office did not want to overreact. We want to make sure we're being smart, being wise with these decisions, and level-headed. So my hope and my plan is for us to get through this and understand, you know what, they didn't overreact, but they had a great plan in place. We had a good, clean, fair election, and the integrity of the election, utmost importance, was upheld. So I think that's just kind of an overview of what we're looking to provide for you here in November. There was a mention of the runoff, and just to answer that question real quickly, we have our supplies coming in. We're going to order those in 2 phases. The first phase will be here in time for us to get them to our runoff for June 23rd, not only there, but also in House District 88. Our National Guard has been very, very helpful for us. They are going to help us to get those supplies out to the courthouses and to the counties that need them. So when you saw some mention of National Guard members being at polling places with rifles and machine guns protecting the vote, that never came from me. That came from some folks that wanted to make political hay. The questions that we got from them and the discussions we had from them was, we want some pen testing on our system to make sure it's safe, it's reliable. As you know, SIMS is a big piece of our election process here in Mississippi, so we wanted to make sure that information was safe from attacks from outside. So that's why we met with the National Guard. And the second piece was, hey, you know what? We can also get your supplies out to your counties pretty quickly and easily. We have that set up now. Those were the 2 things we talked about. Not once ever was there a conversation about, hey, we want you to have an AK-47 right outside the precinct to make sure people saw it. Come on, man. That's not what happened. So I want to clear that up on the front end. You probably have some questions about that. So since that came up, I wanted to talk about it. We've got $4.7 million from CARES Act money that came directly to Secretary of State's offices across the country. There's $400 million that was included in that bill. Our portion was 4.7. We actually have a match to meet that. It's about $900,000, so we'll talk about that on budget day. But we are planning to use that money for things such as protective equipment. We've got plans for gloves. We've got plans for masks. We've got some face shields ordered. We've got social distancing measures that we're putting in place with our precincts. We're preparing printouts for them to use to be able to mark their 6-foot distances. We're printing printouts for them to use at their tables. Hey, this is what you do when you come in. For the touchscreen machines, we've talked to the vendors, and we can use paper straws for them, so people never have to touch the machines. We saw in Madison what they did with the pens was, once they gathered up 50 or so pens, they would go sanitize and wipe them down with wipes. we're prepared. I want y'all to know that. On election day, the precincts are going to be safe. So there are going to be hand sanitizing stations coming in, going out. All of our poll managers and workers will have protective equipment on. We have thought about everything. We've had Zoom meetings with Israel to see what they did in their election, with South Korea. Last night I was on a Zoom meeting with Taiwan. We're talking to everybody to make sure, what did you do, what works, what do we bring here to Mississippi to make sure that we're prepared. And so I want you guys to know that the plan is out there that we've put together is a good one, and it's one that we've included everybody in to make sure that, hey, look, again, it's not just us. It's not the Secretary of State's office, it's the legislature, it's elections commissioners, and it's also our clerks. So I don't know if you want me to walk through our plan real quick. If you've probably seen the op-ed, I can. I don't want to waste your time. I'll hit a couple of the high points that I think are important to talk to you about. We've talked about absentee voting. I think that's a big piece, and I don't know if we will or won't do this, but one of the things we talked about was adding an additional excuse, dealing with a state of emergency once we are under an executive order from the governor to allow folks to vote absentee with that. There are some talks about, do you confine that to a certain limited number of days, or do you add it to the whole 45 days? We've got some concerns there that we'll talk to you about. We think the idea of processing the ballots at the courthouse is great, and we want to do that. I think that's something we're going to support and move forward with. That helps us with poll worker recruitment down the road. When you take a burden off them like that, very helpful. Speaking of poll workers, we're talking to the Bar Association, we're talking to the bankers, to realtors, to encourage them. What we've seen some other states do is offer these continuing education credits if you take training to work the polls. So then you get an additional credit for working the poll that day. So you take training, then you work the polls, you get CLE credits as an attorney or continuing education credits for any other profession. Not only do we want to make sure we're prepared for this election, but we think this is an awesome opportunity to look forward down the road. I don't know if you've been to your precincts lately, but you don't see a bunch of young folks out there working the polls. This is an opportunity for us to say, you know what, we need you. We're partnering with Chevron, we're partnering with some of these bigger companies to say, hey, we need your help now. But that's also going to start down the road. You saw this opportunity here to help out. Now we can continue to include you down the road to get more poll workers in. So that's a big piece of what we're going to do as well. Again, I've talked to you about Election Day and what the precincts will look like. There are some pieces of legislation out there that we want you to help us with. Holly, do you want to touch on some of the legislation real quick? Again, I could talk a lot, but I'll...
Good morning. Thank y'all for having us today. I know both the Senate and the House have measures to increase the number of poll managers. That is definitely something that we need. We're going to need more poll managers to help with social distancing, to help with cleaning the supplies. And then a lot of our counties do have larger precincts that just need more poll workers every election in general. So we definitely want to ensure one of those bills passes this year. And we're also willing to work with the House, the Senate, the election commissioners, and the circuit clerks with regard to absentee voting, but I think we're going in the right direction, to make sure that everybody's needs are met with regard to those matters. But I'll be happy to answer any questions y'all have with regard to the election. I know we're short on time.
Question now, our neighboring Mississippi, we've always, well, to be quite frank, a lot of our ancestors came from the Carolinas, and we've always followed South Carolina generally. And Mississippi, South Carolina has passed a bill, and the governor, I think Governor McMaster signed it, about the COVID being they have basically a no excuses absentee for this election, and a lot of our other states, I guess probably over 40, probably about 45 don't have it. How does that, y'all studied what our other southern states are doing, like South Carolina and things like that, and how that could be adapted to us?
So, as you know, there's currently an excuse to vote by mail, to vote absentee, temporary disability. And we actually talked about that yesterday with our clerks. And I've got all the confidence in the world for our clerks to make those decisions at the local level. I think that's important. Yesterday, matter of fact, I asked the room, is anybody in here of the opinion that you're going to say no, no matter what, if somebody asks because of that excuse? Not a single one of them raised their hand. And said, you know what, what's important for you to know is that we handle absentee voting all the time. When they call, and I encourage you to tell your constituents, call your local circuit clerk. They know the process, they know it well. They know how to ask those additional questions to make sure they feel comfortable this person truly is temporarily disabled, and so we're going to allow them to use that excuse to absentee vote. So from our perspective, you know, I think it's already in the law, and the interpretation piece is where it's important for our clerks who are at the local level, who know their constituency better than I do, better than you guys do, to make those decisions for them after they're given the opportunity to question and talk to them. So that's our approach on that one.
I think I'm supposed to use a microphone, so I picked this one. The first question I have for Senator Watson is, first of all, I thought we had gotten rid of you, and every time I turn around this year, there you are. You're here more this year than you were last year. Do you just miss me? Is that?
I don't have Hal Bryan in my life. Things are going bad.
We've had this conversation before, but I think you have heard me hold forth at length about my opinion that there's just not any voter fraud, there's not that amounts to anything, there's not any voter impersonation, there's not any repeat voting, that all of that's a myth, and voter ID is just a remedy desperately trying to find a disease to cure. So I mention all of that preface to say I am very concerned about absentee voting. And the simple common sense of it is, if you get the ballot and the voter out away from the polling place and out away from the courthouse, out there in the real world, mischief does happen. I had a constituent who had a absentee ballot for her spouse. And she called the clerk's office and says, I'm not sure that my husband is mentally aware enough to vote. What should I do? And the clerk said, well, just hold on to the ballot, and if one day he has a good day and you feel like he's had himself enough to vote, fine. If that doesn't happen, just don't send the ballot back. And I told her it was terrible advice. She should put the ballot on eBay and see what she could get for it. But I'm not sure that everyone is as meticulous about that situation as my constituent, who I think never did return the ballot because her spouse never got to where he knew what he was doing. But I'm fairly certain that there are a number of absentee ballots being cast by family members instead of the person that is addressing them. So that may be a mighty long way of saying that my concern is, what can we do to have more in-person voting to eliminate the need for absentee ballots? The second thing I would say is that, given our current system, where you've got to mail this stuff back and forth, sign here, sign there, does the signature across the flap and all of that silliness is just a trap for the unwary, and it affirmatively is not the fault of voters who are not taking voting seriously. It is the fault of a system which is full of gotchas, and I can't imagine why we care if a signature is over the flap, for Pete's sweet sake. So, the question that I'm getting to is, I have been thinking about methods and what one might do to allow more in-person voting. And I mentioned these as half-baked ideas. They're not suggestions, they're just thoughts. One option would be to have longer polling hours, to go from 6 a.m., say, to 8 p.m. I know there are people that vote first thing in the morning. There are people that vote after work. This would at least allow an opportunity to spread that out, which would reduce the number of lines. There's been discussion of voting for longer periods of time at the clerk's office, which is fine, but there's only one clerk's office in a county. And if we're going to have in-person voting, I think it's almost essential we have that at more than one site. And I don't know how one would go about doing that. I don't know if one would have so many sites for so many individuals, or so many registered voters, or so many supervisors. I don't know how one would do it. But my thought is we need to have more in-person voting and less mail voting. And so my question is, don't you agree with me?
I'll get back to you. I'm not sure about which half-baked casserole you're serving, so we'll talk through that a little more. But one thing I do want the committees to understand is it's a delicate balance in my mind. The integrity of the vote is incredibly important. But I also want to find ways where we can make sure we're making it easy to vote. I want people to know, I want you to vote. This is your opportunity for your voice to be heard in our system. So that delicate balance is one that's going to drive our approach to these answers. And I think absentee is such a big topic in my mind that we can walk through and discuss different pieces of it. How do you make it easier, but make sure you're upholding that integrity of the vote? So that's a longer discussion that we will have one day over some casserole. But I appreciate that. Any more questions? I'm happy to.
A couple more. Representative Summers, I believe you had another one.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm so delighted to hear you say make it easier to vote, because I think there are two ways that we can make it easier to vote, one of them being early voting, and I think this is to echo one of the things that Senator Bryan just said about increased in-person voting, and that's to allow early voting periods, in addition to no excuse absentee voting, because as folks have been saying in the room, the whole process can be cumbersome when it comes to absentee voting. So what is your opinion about offering early voting and no excuse absentee voting for our Mississippians?
My first opinion is our system as is. I understand that the process, signing the flap and the different steps you have to follow can be a little cumbersome. So how do we make that easier is probably the first question. But I also think, in a sense, the idea that we're talking about processing absentee ballots at the courthouse is going to de facto push that to, in a sense, early voting. So how do we, if and when we do that, redesign that whole process? And if we do, what does it look like? So I think this is a larger discussion. Again, I like that idea. I want to go in that direction. So what does that need to look like? Number one, uphold the integrity of election. But number two, let's make sure it's easy for our people to go vote. So along those constraints, that balancing act is where our discussions are going to have to go.
So you are in support of early voting, is what you're saying?
Did not say that. I am in support of processing absentee votes at the courthouse. If you do that, it's going to push it, in a sense, to be early voting, because you're not going to be, you're going to go vote again on election day like you can now.
Okay. You started your comments off by, I guess, negating this message around people with AK-47s being at the precinct, and I wanted to make a comment on that, because with the history of the state of Mississippi, and with Mississippi being ground zero for voting rights for the country, anytime an elected official, particularly someone in your position, mentions military being part of that process, puts a bad taste in the mouth. So I think, we have to be careful about the words that we say when it comes to elections. I don't see access to voting being a partisan issue. I think that we should, as you have already said, make it easier for folks to vote. But you did say in one of your in your op-ed that you released on May 18th that you were developing a plan to uphold Mississippi's steadfast conservative values, and I wanted to understand, what did you mean by that?
I think number one with elections, it's the integrity of the vote. It's making sure that not only do we do our best to make it easier for folks to vote, the whole idea with the elections process, in my mind, conservative mindset, I don't mind using that word, is again, the integrity of the vote. We're honoring our men and women who fought and died for that right. It's one of the most precious rights we have, obviously. But it's not just the military sense. It's also those heroes that fought and wanted the right to vote in the women's right, women's suffrage, the 100th year anniversary here that we have right now, civil rights. It's everyone that had to fight for that right. And in my mind, I want to honor that and uphold the integrity, but honor that as well. And how do we make it easier with that balancing test of moving forward? So in my mind, that's how I see it. That's how I look at it. I do think it's important to note Mississippi is ground zero. I think there are a lot of eyes on Mississippi. We've got an opportunity here to do some good things. And again, I don't want us to be short-sighted and think this is just for COVID, but what are the things that we may be able to try right now that will go further into our legacy of how we changed voting in Mississippi? That's important. I think it's a question that we all have to think in our mindset that history's there, be mindful of it, but also be intelligent and smart and uphold the integrity of election as you move forward.
Very good. Then Secretary of State, now Lieutenant Governor, had also received millions of dollars for election security a couple of years ago when I was election commissioner, and I know that you've also received some funds and intend on using that for election security. What more security do you need, and how much do you think that that's going to cost?
Yeah, so this year in HAVA dollars, we got roughly $5 million, just north of $5 million. And again, those are things that we can partner with our counties on. And what we have done in the past and what we will do in the future is there's a formula that each county has allotted a certain amount of dollars, and they can use those on expenses dealing with cybersecurity and other issues. What you'll see from us is a big piece of that is SIMS. Again, that's a huge part of what we do in elections, making sure that data is safe. If it's upgrading computers, if it's upgrading software, if it's upgrading, the cybersecurity defense out there. That's one of the things that we have done, continue to meet with the National Guard. We've talked to the National Association of Secretaries of State. We've talked to CISA under the FBI. We've talked to DHS. Those are continued conversations that we can't stop. There's no finish line there. That's a continued process. So those are the dollars that are going to help us make sure that we're there to defend our system. Again, that doesn't stop. That's going to ongoing expense. So there's only a limited number of dollars to do that with. The other thing that we've talked about, and voting machines came up there, we can use those dollars for some voting machines. The problem is, once you start diluting that money and sending it to the counties, you don't have as much buying power. So what we have done on that is, and I know I mentioned this to them, we're moving forward with the process of RFP and going out for a bid to purchase statewide to get a better bulk purchase price. That process is in place. So we don't want to be flat-footed. We want to move on every angle that we think is possible. So that one's actually going to go print in the newspaper next week. So it's moving. We want to be prepared if the opportunity came and you guys saw fit, hey, we want to go in this direction. Okay, we're ready. Here are the prices. Here are the vendors. Let's go. So I think it's important. It's a holistic approach. It's conversations that you and I have had, out of a committee room. It's conversations that Hobb and I have had. Excuse me, Senator Bryan. He also called me Senator Watson. I appreciate that. Good to be back. So it's a lot of moving pieces with elections, and it takes intelligent folks who want the right thing to sit down and talk. And look, I appreciate Senator Bryan's comments. We may get to the same point of, you know what, I'm not so sure about absentee. How do we make that better? He gets there a different route than I do, but that's okay. We can talk about the differences, and at the end of the day, let's come up with something that's best for all of us. And you're exactly right. This is not a partisan issue to me. This is what's good for Mississippi, understanding our past, knowing where we want to go in the future, integrity of the vote, but let's make sure everybody can play a role in that process.
And this is my last question, I promise, and I really appreciate you, Secretary Watson, for answering my questions. You also mentioned in one of your op-eds that you intended on sending informational postcards to voters, which I think is a great thing. But I also know as an election commissioner that when we send out notifications and they return to our office, that could be a trigger for marking those voters inactive. So my question is, what do you intend on doing with those postcards that are returned to your office?
That's a good question. So the initial idea is to include as much information as possible on the voting process. I think far too many people, and you know, Senator Blackwell mentioned it earlier, I don't know how many Mississippians know that if you go cast an absentee vote, you can then go vote again on election day. So it's making sure that Mississippians understand the process. Here is all you need to know about elections. Here are your precincts, here are your clerk's numbers, here are your everything that you need to know to make sure that you can participate in the process. We have talked about a couple of different things on the postcards, with a return address or not. Do we return them to the clerk's offices? Do we return them to the Secretary of State's office? That's a conversation, and you're right, that could be the triggering event, but that's a conversation that's ongoing that we have not finalized yet. It's a conversation that I'm happy to include you in if that's something that you are quite interested in and want to work on with us. I think it's important, number one, that we get the information out there. And one of the things that I've stressed to our communications group is, listen, I want people to understand what we do in every facet, especially elections. Let's make sure we get that information out there every opportunity we get. So that's one of the things that we thought we could use a postcard for, to get the information out as well.
Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Our final question will come from Senator Blunt.
Time's up, right?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I know it's late, and so I'll be very brief. First, Mr. Secretary, Senator Class of 2007, I think you're exactly right to proceed with this RFP. I think what you said about the purchasing power and coordinating it through your office to deal with some of these machines that are 15, 20 years old, I think that's exactly where we need to be headed, and I'm glad to see you're taking the lead on that. One question, to return to work, you mentioned this earlier, that you had a call with the clerks, and I think I heard you say that it was the consensus on that call that the current language that allows for a person to vote, qualify to vote absentee because they have a temporary or permanent physical disability, would allow a person in a COVID environment to check that box and use the existing process. Is that what I heard you say?
It was a broad discussion, one that I thought was very good, and I'll let them speak to that if they'd like to, but the consensus was, listen, we've heard all the excuses, the dog ate my homework, we've heard it all. So we feel like if you would just allow us to have those conversations with those voters, and we understand this, he's serious, she's serious. This is an issue that we feel like they are sincere, it's the right thing to do, we're going to apply that. And what you see from the clerks, in my mind, every single one of them that I've talked to go above and beyond to make sure they're allowing people to vote. Is there anything that I can do to make sure this person's included, that they have the opportunity to have their voice heard? I'm very comfortable with that. And I feel like giving them, back to the conservative mindset, that local control, you know your folks better than I do. You're going to be able to talk to them. You're going to know when they're giving you a crock, or you're going to know when they're serious and sincere. So you make that decision. I think that latitude is there for them to be granted that permission and that authority to make that decision. So I'm comfortable with that.
Great, thank you.
Appreciate everyone who came to participate and who, Secretary of State's office, Election Commissioner, Circuit Clerks, we cannot thank you enough for being willing to come here to offer us your suggestions and to help us to understand how it is on the ground, because that's where you are. We thank you for everything, and our meeting is adjourned.